And it came to pass that after these things, that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker, that he had them thrown in prison where Joseph was confined. Do you remember that on the end of last story that Joseph was put into jail and he found favor in the keeper of the jail? And the keeper of the jail just let Joseph do whatever he needed to. He took care, he was in charge of every prisoner that was there. Why? Because God gave him favor. One of the true and key things here is that when we allow God to do with us what he has planned out for us, that we don't complain. We keep pressing forward regardless of the situation, the circumstance that might come in front of us. That we just remember and realize who we serve and that we do his will. God has a purpose, a plan for each and every one of us. So the chief butler and the chief baker were thrown into prison where Joseph was confined. That when the butler and the baker who were in prison had a dream, and both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. The men happened to be there, and they were under the command of Joseph. Joseph was in charge of everyone. That he saw the butler and the baker there. And it just says that one day when the butler and the baker, in one evening, the same evening, they had a dream. And they didn't have no interpreter for them. The scripture says that Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. That he asked Pharaoh's officers, the butler and the baker, why do you look so sad today? And verse 8, it says, and they both said to him, we each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not the interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. So the butler tells his dream. In verse 9, it says, then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream, a vine set before me. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and brought forth and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. In verse 12, I see Joseph there listening to the dream. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. That the 3 branches are 3 days. And now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you into your place. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. In verse 14, but remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. Verse 15, for indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me in the dungeon. And the baker is there, and he listens to the interpretation. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he also said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there was 3 white baskets on my head. And the uppermost baskets were all kinds of basket goods for Pharaoh. And the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. And there is Joseph again, and he's listening to that, and he tells him the interpretation, and he said, this is the interpretation of it, that within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now that doesn't sound like a very good interpretation of what the baker thought that he was going to get. The scripture also says that it came to pass that on the 3rd day that it was Pharaoh's birthday, and that he made a feast for all of his servants, and that he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Just like Joseph had interpreted the butler's dream. And he hanged the baker as Joseph had also interpreted his dream. In verse 23, the scripture says that the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot. If you recall that one of the things is that Joseph asked the butler, but remember me. Mention to Pharaoh about me, so that I may get out of this place. In the sense, the chief butler owed his life to Joseph, who had correctly interpreted his dream. All that Joseph asked in return was to be remembered once the butler was reinstalled in his position. The account implies that the butler agreed to do so, but like so many people, he forgot his promise once he got out of trouble. How many of us sometimes have come into a circumstance that we ask God to get us out of this situation that you might find yourself? And a lot of us might pledge that if you do that, I will come and worship you. And when God has brought forth of what you asked of him, what you prayed, then all of a sudden you forget. You're out of trouble now that you're forgetting of what you have promised. The butler forgot about what he promised to Joseph. And it was not until 2 full years had gone by, and Pharaoh remembered to have a dream of his own. Can you imagine 2 full years after the butler was restored to his position again, that Joseph, as time went by, he kept wondering, when is he going to get me out of here? That 1 year went by, and 2 years. The scripture says that 2 full years went by. The scripture says in chapter 41, verse 1, and Pharaoh remembered, and Pharaoh happened to have a dream of his own, that the butler remembered his commitment, apparently with some guilt. was awakened. Let's go to 41 verse 9. You know, I like going back to the scriptures here because like that it knows that exactly what I'm saying about here is exactly what the word says here. Okay, verse 9. Actually, it's verse 1. I'm going to read. It says, Then it came to pass at the end of the 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, that he stood by the river, and suddenly that there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. And then behold, that 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. So here the scripture is saying that all of a sudden here, shortly after that Pharaoh had a dream. And in his dream, he saw 7 cows by the river, 7 good-looking cows, fat and plump. And then right after that, 7 ugly and gaunt cows came up after them. And let's read on. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the river, and the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. And I could see Pharaoh dreaming and awakes and trying to figure out what it meant. How many of you have ever had a dream that it wakes you up? And then you try to go back to sleep, and sometimes you can't, and then sometimes you fall asleep and you dream something similar to what you just had. So let's see. Read on here. It says, verse 5, it says, He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly the 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. And then behold, that 7 thin heads, blinded by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Pharaoh's dream says, and he awakens again and realized it was a dream, but couldn't try to figure out what it all meant. And the scripture says that the next morning he awakens and he's all troubled. That he calls all the magicians around Egypt and all the wise men to come and gather. In those days, the kings had magicians and the wise men to advise them in certain areas that they needed advice. The scripture says that he brought them forth and he told them their dream. And the scripture says neither the magicians or the wise men could interpret the dream. They didn't know what it meant. And the scripture says that as troubled as Pharaoh was, because nobody could interpret the dream, that he became angry. And I could just imagine when somebody is angry, you know, it's someone that you don't want to be around. You probably experienced that with either mom or dad, your brothers, somebody at work, somebody at school, wherever it was. You get somebody up to a point where they are boiling mad and angry that you just want to stay out of the way. But it was for a good reason. That the butler remembers Joseph. The butler happens to see Pharaoh all upset. And it wasn't the first time that he saw him. Because you remember, they had offended Pharaoh and they were thrown into the slammer, into the dungeon. So it was a reflection, a remembrance. And he said, oh my goodness. The scripture says that the butler remembers after seeing Pharaoh very angry with his servants, that he tells Pharaoh that when he was in prison, that there was a prisoner that had interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker. And they came true as the interpreter had said. And Pharaoh is listening to them, since to the butler that he sends for Joseph. He goes, go bring me that prisoner. Scripture says that it went quickly and got Joseph. Scripture says that they got him cleaned up, dressed up to come before the king. The Pharaoh tells Joseph that he had a dream and that no one has been able to interpret his dream. But I have heard of you that you can interpret a dream. And the scripture says that Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So Pharaoh tells Joseph his dream. And after Joseph hears the dream, that Joseph tells Pharaoh that your dreams mean the first one and the second are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he or what God is about to do. And he interprets that the 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads are also 7 years. And in verse 29 is, indeed 7 years of great will come throughout all the land of Egypt. Which means that there will be an abundance of whatever they did. An abundance of their crops, of the harvest, in abundance for 7 years. Those were the good cows, and those were the 7 good years that reflects to that. He says, verse 30, but after them 7 years, that 7 years a famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land of Egypt. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. It was good for those 7 years, but it soon will be forgotten because of the famine that was going to come. Scripture says that it was going to be so severe that the 7 good years are going to be forgotten. In verse 32, and Joseph keeps interpreting his dream. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will surely bring it to pass. Amen, glory be to God. When God is in the plans, when God is in the middle of the circumstance and the situation, God will bring it to pass. Many of you have probably experienced that. And if you haven't, then just be patient. Keep doing what you're doing. Even though it looks like you've reached a wall and you just bumped your head on it, that you can't go forth anymore, just keep pressing. God will bring it to pass. And he tells Pharaoh in verse 35 says, let Pharaoh, let me take it back. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Man, I'm getting excited here. It says Joseph recommends a plan. Okay? This is verse 33 says, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. In verse 34 and 35 it says, let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plentiful years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them store their food in the cities. Now, verse 36, then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, and that the land may not perish in the famine. Now see how God is using Joseph? That everything starts in a dream. When Joseph, one of Jacob's favorite sons, tells a dream to his brothers, that they hated him even more. And they hated him even more when Jacob made him a robe, a coat of many colors. He had some enemies that he was going up against. He gets thrown into a pit. His brothers have a plan. They get him out and sell him into slavery. And then Joseph is found that he is bought. And he is in charge of running the whole household. And then because he didn't heed into Potiphar's wife, and whatever lies that she said about him got him thrown into jail. And being in jail, he finds favor through the mercy of God. Because there is a plan that God is putting together. And Joseph is the main culprit, the main person that God is going to use for a purpose, for the future. So Joseph is saying all this because let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers that he'll be in charge. That for them to gather up and save 1/5 of all the produce that is going to be in the years of the plenty, which would mean 20% of everything that was grown there. They were going to take it and store it for a reserve to plan ahead for those 7 years of famine that was to come. The scripture says that the device was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. That Pharaoh says to his servants, he says, can we find such a wise man as this? A man in whom is the Spirit of God. In verse 39, it says, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. Verse 40, You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. God is showing favor again to Joseph. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over the land, all the land of Egypt. Verse 42 says, Then Pharaoh took his signature ring off his hand, and he put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and he put a gold chain around his neck. Some of the things that it was very, very important that whether people there knew or not, it had been introduced to Joseph, they knew by that signature of whoever had that ring meant that they were in charge of everything there. Royalty had now come in. Joseph had in his possession that ring. And he was clothed with fine linen and a gold chain around him. It didn't look like the same Joseph that worked in Potiphar's house or that came into prison. Now, he was a well-known, respectable person, given charge, second in command over all the land of Egypt. Verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. Not only that, but one of the luxury automobiles that Pharaoh had there. I mean, I don't know if it was a Mercedes or a Bentley but it was one of the second chariots that he had. He had Joseph riding it next to him. Wow, isn't that something? Which he had, and they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, that no man may lift his hand or foot in all of Egypt. Look, from where Joseph came, one of his second dreams is coming true. When he was just 17 years old, that he told his brothers. Verse 45, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name, he changed his name to Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath. Boy, that sounds kind of, Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was given supreme command over Egypt. Some have equated him with a prime minister. But he probably held more authority than a modern prime minister, since his was an appointed, not an elected position. Apparently, Joseph was the chief magistrate over Egypt with a wide-ranging powers, perhaps including oversight of legal, foreign, financial, military, civil, historical, agriculture, and commercial affairs. Everything Joseph was in command. The only other person that he had to respond to was Pharaoh and God. Okay, so he is the second in command. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine. One of the things that Joseph told him, 7 good years, 7 bad years. Appoint someone in command to put in reserve for the bad years. That kind of sounds something like what we have nowadays in our modern day, that we work and we try to store up and save as much as we can, store up for when maybe might be a layoff, maybe might be for the future when we no longer are working, we are retired, to help us through the end of our years. Joseph was in command. The scripture says that when the famine was in all the land, that the famine struck Egypt and all the lands around it. For 7 years, the crops in all the lands around it, that no crops would grow and people could not find food anywhere. The news that Egypt had food in the storehouse spread quickly. People came from many nations to ask Joseph if they could buy food. One of the things is that when all this took place, not only Egypt, but all around the land there. Now, if you remember that Jacob was from the land of Canaan, but it was somewhat close to there. Scripture says that the famine was so severe that it went through all Egypt and all around in the lands there. The news that Egypt had food in its storehouse spread quickly. People came from many nations to ask Joseph if they could buy food. One group of people who came was Joseph's 10 older brothers. His younger Benjamin stayed home with their father. And when the brothers came before Joseph, that Joseph recognized them immediately. But they didn't know who Joseph was. They thought their brother was a slave, not a ruler. Joseph pretended not to know who they were. And he asked, "Who are you? And where have you come from?" And I could see the brothers there standing in front of Joseph. It says, "We are the sons of Jacob, and we have come from the land of Canaan to buy grain." The brothers answered. And Joseph is sitting there on his throne. I can see his throne, He's a guy second in command. He's not just going to be standing up or sitting in just any chair. I'm sure that he had something similar to what Pharaoh had. He says, "No, I know better. I know that you are here to spy on my land," Joseph said. And Joseph insisted that they were lying. And he said that he would only believe their story if they went back and got their youngest brother. Because in this interview, he found out that their youngest brother had stayed home with father. So Joseph is testing him, and he says, the only way that I can believe your story is if you went back and got your younger brother, which would happen to be the youngest brother. In verse 17, it says, the scripture says that he put them all together in jail for 3 days. He let them sit there and meditate of what had just happened, what was told to them for them to do. Verse 18, then Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to the prison house. But you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses. And bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die.